This video reviews evidence goodness. In class, we discussed good and bad evidence. When evidence is good, you can believe the conclusions. When evidence is bad, you cannot believe the conclusions. We use a rating scale from 0 to 2 to rate evidence goodness. A rating of a 0. This is very bad evidence. This means we cannot believe the conclusions at all. We should ignore this evidence and not think about it anymore. A rating of a 1. This is not very good evidence, but it is not totally bad evidence. This means we can believe the conclusion, but we have to be careful about how heavily we rely on it. A rating of a 2. This is good or very good evidence. This means we believe the conclusion. The evidence supports that the conclusion is correct. Some important criteria for evaluating evidence are sample size, comparison groups, and credibility of a source. Sample size is the number of observations or participants. A good sample size should be large and random to be representative of the population that is being studied. There are two types of comparison groups, in the laboratory and in nature. In a laboratory, there can be a control group and an experimental group. In nature, the experimental and control conditions are determined by nature or other factors that are not controlled by the investigator. Credibility of the source is very important. You should consider the source's credentials. Is the source qualified in the subject area? Is the source biased or in favor of one side compared to another? Is the source competent or able to do something successfully and efficiently? Let's look at a scenario and then evaluate 3 pieces of evidence involving the scenario. The honeybee population has decreased by 60% since the 1940s, causing damage to farms and agriculture. Scientists asked members of a small farming town how the decreased bee population has infected their crops. Evidence number 1. A young farmer's daughter mentioned that she saw fewer melon, carrot, and apple crops on her family farm this year than in the past. She believes there are less crops because there were less bees to pollinate the crops. How would you rate this evidence? 0, very bad. 1, not very bad, but not very good. Or 2, very good. Does this evidence have a good sample size? Think about the girl's credibility, bias, and competence. Evidence number 2. Last year, colony collapse disorder was blamed for the loss of about half the honeybee hives in the United States. This sharp decline in honeybee population has led scientists from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to study the effects of CCD on agriculture. Scientists talked to 10 local farmers about their crop production over the past few years. 8 out of 10 farmers said that they have been having trouble producing many pollinated crops and that they think the loss of bees is the cause. How would you rate this evidence? 0, very bad. 1, not very bad, but not very good. Or 2, very good. Does this evidence have a good sample size? Think about the comparison groups, credentials, bias, and competence. Evidence number 3. Scientists from the U.S. Department of Agriculture want to study the side effects of colony collapse disorder, which has caused a 60% decrease in the honeybee populations since the 1940s on small local farms. Scientists studied 200 farms in Southern California that have used an insecticide that may that has caused mass bee deaths. 85% of farmers reported that they lost at least 40% of their bee colonies this past year, and a 45% loss of pollinated crops, such as melons, cranberries, and almonds. Based on their knowledge about the harm of insecticide on bee populations, the scientists conclude that the decreased bee population has led to limited crop yield. How would you rate this evidence? 0, very bad. 1, not very bad, but not very good. Or 2, very good. Is this a good sample size in this evidence? Think about the comparison group, credentials, bias, and competence. You should have noticed a difference in quality of evidence 1, 2, and 3.